Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 360. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, but first I want to remind everyone that we are doing our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. So if you head on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate, there's a lot of great kit bets and there's a lot of great ways that you could help our institute. Of course, the great Scott Horton started the institute and put this together. It's Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Keith Knight, Lori Calhoun, Connor Freeman, who's the co-host of this show, Will Porter, who often writes with me at the Libertarian Institute, and a lot of other great writers, podcasters, previous guests of this show even. So head on over to the Libertarian Institute and check out everything that we're doing. And once you see the great quality of our work, I'm sure you won't mind giving us a donation to help us keep this thing going. I will also mention that we, myself and Will Porter, use the Substack account for the Libertarian Institute to post all of our news stories. So, if you want like a email list type thing of all the Libertarian Institute news, just go ahead and sign up for the Substack. It's also a way you could donate to the show, or not the show, the Institute itself. So go on over to the libertarianinstitute.org again and check out the donate page. Get yourself some kit bags, support our institute. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into the show. All right, first piece today is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He says the House passes the record $858 billion National Defense Authorization Act. The House on Thursday passed the massive $858 billion 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, in a vote of 350 to 80, sending the bill to the Senate, where a vote is expected to be held next week. The $858 billion NDAA is $45 billion more than President Biden asked for, making it the second year in a row that Congress has made the military budget higher than the White House requested. The amount represents an 8% increase from the 22 NDAA. And of course, as always, it's, the Pentagon will sometimes get a raise that's consistent with inflation, but nearly nobody else in this country will. The troops don't. When I say the Pentagon, I just mean, the upper tier of that in the arms makers and everybody connected who profits off it. According to the Defense News, the 2023 NDAA dropped amendments added to the House version that would have restricted weapon sales to countries accused of human rights abuses. Such provisions were included in the House version of the NDAA, but didn't make it past the final version that was negotiated with the Senate. Notable amendments packed into the NDAA include a measure that will give the Pentagon wartime purchasing powers by allowing non-competitive multi-year contracts for certain arms. The authority could be used to refill U.S. stockpiles, arm Ukraine, and assist foreign governments that have provided support to Ukraine. The list of munitions the Pentagon is allowed to procure using the purchasing powers is extensive, including HIMAR rocket launch systems, 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. And Dave says the list is much longer. U.S. weapons manufacturers benefit greatly from the newest authority, especially Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, as many of their systems are on the list. The multi-year contracts will incentivize the arms makers to significantly ramp up production. And of course, particularly with Lockheed and Raytheon, you have so many people in the upper echelon of the Pentagon that have invested stakes in these countries and are companies and are former employees of these companies. And so it's no surprise that so many Raytheon weapons end up on the list, since that's where the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin previously worked. But it's likely that he's going to be able to drive a lot of money into his former employer. The NDAA includes unprecedented military aid for Taiwan, including $10 billion that will be distributed over 5 years, and $1 billion in annual presidential drawdown authority, which will allow the U.S. to send Taipei weapons directly from Pentagon stockpiles. Ukraine will receive $800 million in the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative from the NDAA, a program that allows the U.S. government to purchase weapons on behalf of Ukraine. And we've talked about the difference between the USAI, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and the PDA, the Presidential Drawdown Authority, and how the two are meaningfully different, and why it creates some differences between the two. So the USAI is when the U.S. government is getting contracts or giving contracts to weapons makers to buy weapons for Ukraine, where the PDA is just sending weapons directly from American stockpiles. So now I'm going to move on and talk about an article I wrote yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. All right, so my piece for the Institute is titled "Three Democratic Lawmakers Make Diplomatic Visit to Cuba." A delegation from the Congressional Progressive Caucus met with the Cuban president in a rare high-level meeting among government officials. Washington maintains a Cold War-era embargo against Havana. The Associated Press reported Representatives James McGovern, Mark Pocan, and Troy Carter met with Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel in Havana on Sunday. The president of Cuba, that's Miguel Diaz-Canel, tweeted, "We addressed our differences and topics of interest. The shared will into improved bilateral relations was ratified. I expressed the need to put an end to measures that harm the Cuban population." And I'm sure there he's talking about sanctions. He recently gave an interview when he talked about how, he's not a young man and he's lived his entire life under the American embargo. Havana was a client state of Moscow throughout much of the Cold War. Washington first sanctioned weapon sales to Cuba in 1958. 2 years later, Cuba nationalized American-owned businesses. The U.S. responded by placing an embargo on Cuba. In February 1962, Washington extended the blockade of Cuba to include nearly all exports. 8 months later, the U.S. and USSR nearly engaged in a nuclear exchange over the strategic missiles deployed in Cuba. Near the end of his second term, Barack Obama took a number of steps to normalize relations with Cuba. President Donald Trump walked back nearly all of Obama's détente policies. The Trump administration justified the U-turn, claiming American diplomats in Cuba were targeted with a mysterious weapon that caused a wide variety of symptoms. The U.S. government dubbed the so-called disease Havana syndrome. However, recordings of the alleged weapons was identified to be the sound of native crickets. Joe Biden was expected to adopt a policy of his former boss for Cuba, but the White House has been slow to return to diplomacy with Havana. In July 2021, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Cuba over human rights abuses committed by government forces. While the Cuban government is repressive, the worst human rights abuses in Cuba occur at Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. military occupies a portion of the island and has operated an infamous torture prison on the base for 2 decades. In June, the White House eased some sanctions on Havana, signaling some loosening of the embargo. Last month at the UN, the U.S. voted to keep the blockade against Cuba. Recent talks between Washington and Havana have focused on slowing Cuban immigration to the U.S. and not necessarily normalizing ties. And so I guess a couple of different levels here. I think that the Congressional Progressive Caucus is likely close enough, and Mark Pocan is one of the leaders of that caucus. So my guess is that this was more or less officially sanctioned by the White House. I don't think they would have done it over a stern objection from the White House. And so I think this is a positive sign that the Biden administration, not just, some members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, actually want to start to return at least to the Obama policy towards Cuba. However, if you look at actually what the White House policy has been towards the Caribbean and Latin America, basically their biggest concern is slowing immigration, and not, as Kamala Harris said, don't come, you will not be welcome. And so I think that's basically, the track they're going down here. But my guess is that's not what these progressives went to Cuba to talk about. And so maybe we are seeing some real progress here. Again, we did have some loosening of the embargo in June, but then continuing to vote for it at the UN. All right, so now, several stories by Dave here, DeCamp that is, on the situation in Russia with the war in Ukraine and everything going on. So first, drone attack hits another airbase inside Russian territory. An airfield in Russia was targeted by a drone on Tuesday, 2 days after bases deep inside Russian territory were hit by Ukrainian drones. Tuesday's attack targeted an airfield that is about 80 miles from the Ukrainian border, causing a nearby oil tank to catch fire. The region's governor said there were no casualties in the incident. The attacks on Monday hit targets hundreds of miles inside Russia. This is last Monday, a week ago today, the deepest Ukrainian drone strikes in Russian territory since the February 24th invasion. Later on Monday, Russia launched another massive missile barrage across Ukraine, targeting energy infrastructure. And so with that, again, this was last week. Now some stories that have come out over the weekend and into the beginning of this week. Pentagon gives tacit support for Ukrainian drone attacks deep inside Russia. The Pentagon has given its tacit support of drone attacks inside Russian territory and no longer fears such operations could lead to a dramatic Russian escalation, the Times reported on Friday, citing unnamed U.S. officials. The position appears to be only based on the fact that up till this point, Russia hasn't responded to the attack on its territory with nuclear weapons or by attacking NATO countries. The Times read, Moscow's revenge attacks have to date all involved conventional military strikes against civilian targets. Previously, the Pentagon was wary of Ukrainian attacks Russia because it fears the Kremlin would retaliate either with tactical nuclear weapons or by targeting NATO nations. And so I guess two things to look at here. One, if the Pentagon is really reassessing if Russia is considering using nuclear weapons based on these I guess, the two strikes on the bases deep inside Russia did hit strategic bases that hold strategic weapons for Russia. So there is some significance there. But the idea that Russia would launch a nuclear strike based on, the small number of attacks, and again, they did hit a base that does house nuclear bombers. At the same time, it still appears to be fairly minor. They're not attacking the Kremlin. They're not doing anything that's actually going to threaten the Kremlin. And so the idea that Russia would have used nuclear weapons in any of these situations is quite absurd. And then, of course, I'm sure in Moscow, they calculate that if they do attack Poland, say, that, war with NATO and nuclear war 6 months, a year down the road if we're lucky. And so, nothing that Ukraine has done, I think, has actually posed an existential threat to the Russian state up until this point. And so then there's no reason to assume that Moscow would have used nuclear weapons up until this point. And so if the Pentagon is now saying that we don't think Russia will use nuclear weapons as far as we push them, this is absolutely absurd and very concerning, especially since there is a great op-ed today in the Viewpoint section of antiwar.com by Ray McGovern explaining how Putin is really screaming and talking about actually fundamentally changing Russia's nuclear policy to deal with this. So it's quite significant. And then the other part of this I just want to, point out here is that this is very clearly an example of this war being all about weakening Russia and having nothing to do with the civilians, the Ukrainian people, as the Pentagon is saying that we have no concern about Russia, targeting civilian strikes, targets within Ukraine and crippling their power grid and things like that as winter approaches, because they're not attacking other NATO members and they're not using nuclear weapons. And so now they're willing to escalate more. Next article, Putin says Russia's war in Ukraine is a long process. This from Dave DeCamp on December 7th. Almost 10 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin acknowledged on Wednesday that Russia's special military operation is a long process and signaled he has no plans to give up the Ukrainian territory Russia has captured. And I want to follow this up with that other story just because, to understand the Russian mindset here and why Russia hasn't resorted to nuclear weapons is they do see this as a long war at this point, and they're willing to do what it takes to take what the Kremlin wants and, to take the time they need to make that happen. Now, this is one of the most concerning stories that Dave has written in the past week. NATO chief says full-blown war with Russia is a real possibility. So, Secretary General of the Alliance, Jens Stoltenberg, warned on Friday that he fears a full-blown war between Russia and NATO, and that is a real possibility and a rare acknowledgement of the dangers of backing Ukraine. I fear the war in Ukraine will get out of control and to spread into a major war between NATO and Russia, he said, according to the Telegraph. If things go wrong, they could go wrong horribly. And so just imagine, that Stoltenberg is talking with Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon, right? And so he kind of knows what the Pentagon is thinking and doing. And so Stoltenberg is worried that this war is going to expand and become a war between NATO and Russia. And at the same time, the Pentagon is signing off on longer range strikes inside of Russia. Almost guaranteeing the thing that Stoltenberg is now warning about is going to happen. It's almost unbelievable, that these things can all be going on in NATO at the same time, but they are, and it is one of the things that really makes me worry that we are on the path to nuclear war. I've been talking about this for a while, feeling like you're maybe like in a car and you're headed towards like a gorge or a canyon or something like that. The road's out, right? Well, you're 50 miles away, but everybody in the car is, chanting death and they're going really fast and you're stuck in the middle seat so you can't get out and nobody has any intention of slowing down at this point. And now we're getting a little bit closer. 6 months ago, I thought we were still very far away from here, but with the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Americans, from Brussels, from Putin, the Kremlin, I think we need to be very concerned about this possibility and really start talking about de-escalating this situation to avoid, civilization ending nuclear war. All right, so we have a new weapons transfer to Ukraine. This by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. announces new $275 million arms package for Ukraine. The U.S. on Friday, this I guess was Friday, I think the 9th, announced a $275 million arms package for Ukraine that includes ammunition for HIMARS rockets, marking the 27th drawdown from the U.S. military stockpiles for Ukrainians. Announcing the new package, the Pentagon said that the U.S. pledged over $19.3 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia invaded. The funds for the new arms are being pulled from previous Ukraine aid spending bill that was approved in September. According to the Pentagon, the new $275 million package includes ammunition for HIMARS, an undisclosed number, 80,155 millimeter artillery rounds, and I believe Dave, right? Yeah, he does say here that this puts it over a total of 1 million artillery rounds that the U.S. has now sent to Ukraine in the past 10 months. Counter unmanned aerial system equipment, counter air defense capabilities, high mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, ambulances, and other medical equipment, approximately 150 generators, and field equipment. The arms packages brings a total, I said that, over 1 million, 155 millimeter rounds. The U.S. military stockpiles are being depleted. The U.S. Army is planning a dramatic increase in ammunition production to bring inventory levels up to higher than before the Russian invasion. And just think about this. Right now, the U.S. is producing 40,000 artillery rounds a month. And this, just with this one package, we're sending double that amount to Ukraine. All right. One thing that is happening here that is pretty concerning is the U.S. is considering giving cluster bombs to Ukraine. According to a report for CNN, the Biden administration is considering a request from Ukraine to provide cluster bombs, munitions that are banned by over 100 countries under an international treaty due to the harm they cause civilians. Cluster munitions scatter small bombs called bomblets over large areas, making them more indiscriminate than other munitions. Small bombs often do not explode on impact, making the damage a huge danger to civilians who come across them as like a landmine situation. And I think even worse, I read a lot of reports about things like this happening where these bomblets are smaller silver balls, and so kids tend to pick them up and blow up themselves and their friends, throwing these things to each other. The 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions that banned the weapons has 108 signatories, but the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine are not parties to the treaty. Since Russia lost its invasion in February, both Ukrainian and Russian forces have used cluster munitions, and Kiev was accused of using these bombs in populated areas in the Donetsk region back in 2014. The last known time the U.S. used a cluster bomb was in Yemen in 2009. Before that, U.S. forces used them in the early days of the Afghan War and in Iraq in 2003. The U.S. supplied cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia, which has used them for the war in Yemen. The CNN reports that the Biden administration has been fielding requests from Ukraine for cluster munitions for months and has not rejected it outright. The administration hasn't taken the option off the table if U.S. stockpiles and other munitions become dangerously low. And of course, this will plague the Ukrainian people for probably decades to come. All the time we still from Vietnam, you hear these stories of farmers who are plowing their fields and they hit one of these leftover bomblets, and it could kill them, destroy farm equipment, maim them. These things happen quite a bit. All right, Ukraine aid audit bill voted down by Democrat-led panel. The House Foreign Affairs Committee on Tuesday narrowly voted down a bill that would audit the tens of billions of dollars that Congress has approved to spend on the war in Ukraine. The bill was rejected by the Democrat-led panel on a vote of 26 to 22. The legislation was introduced by Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene and a small group of Republicans who opposed U.S. aid to Ukraine, but it received strong support from more hawkish Republicans. Republicans Thomas Massie, Matt Gaetz, Barry Moore, and Andrew Clyde co-sponsored Greene's bill. Greene said that she will reintroduce the measure in the next Congress when Republicans have a majority in the House. It's official. The Democrats voted no for transparency, for the American people, for an audit, for Ukraine. The Greene wrote on Twitter after the vote, but we take over in January. This audit is going to happen. I really doubt it's going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if once the Republicans are in power, they kind of stonewall and prevent Marjorie Taylor Greene from pushing this bill too far forward, but we'll see what happens. I shouldn't be too negative. Rep. Michael McCall, who is expected to head the Foreign Affairs Committee in the next Congress, has come out in favor of the bill. The era of writing blank checks is over, he said to the Washington Post. McCall has been critical of the Biden administration for not sending longer-range weapons to Ukraine, but wants to encourage Ukrainian strikes on Crimea despite the risk of escalation. But he represents the mainstream Republicans who want to keep arming Ukraine, but agree that there should be more oversight, which the Democrat here, Adam Smith, calls Russian propaganda. And so, again, it's not going to be a great situation when the Republicans take over. Maybe there's these little scenarios where it does get marginally better because the Republicans, unlike the Ukrainians, are willing to have the Democrats are willing to have a little bit of oversight of this program. All right. Very interesting article here from Dave on December 7th. Report, Ukraine asked for NATO leftover Afghan funds. NATO is considering using $3.4 billion in funds that were meant to support the now defunct U.S.-backed Afghan government to provide more aid to Ukraine, Politico reported on Wednesday. Known as the Afghan National Army Trust Fund, the money was donated by individual NATO countries. The report says Kiev has asked NATO to consider using the money to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. The U.S. is not a contributor to the Afghan fund, but has previously provided Ukraine with military equipment that was meant for the old Afghan government. Earlier this year, the U.S. sent 16 Russian-made Mi-17 helicopters that were originally procured for Afghanistan. Western officials told Politico that NATO allies have discussed using Afghan funds for Ukraine and are leaning towards doing so, although the decision is up to each individual country. The funds are currently frozen, and NATO is either going to transfer the funds back to the donor countries or into a new fund for Ukraine. If the money is used for Kiev, it will likely go to the Ukrainian Comprehensive Assistance Package, a NATO fund established in 2016 to give aid to Ukraine. Ukraine is entirely reliant on aid from the West to fund its war effort and keep the government afloat. Besides the military support, Ukraine wants Western backers to provide and cover its massive $38 billion budget deficit for 2023. And of course, here that there are a lot of suffering Ukrainian people, and I'm sure this money could be used for them, but since this money isn't an Afghan fund, it may be a good idea to use it to alleviate a lot of the suffering going on in Afghanistan. Poland changes course, will accept German Patriot missiles. On Tuesday, the Polish defense minister said that the country would accept a German offer to deploy Patriot air defense missile system to Polish territory, changing course after Warsaw rejected the idea. Germany made the offer after a Ukrainian air defense missile landed in Polish territory, killing 2 people. Poland initially said it would accept, but then rebuffed the offer, suggesting the Patriots should instead be sent to Kiev. Germany dismissed the idea since they would be offering to deploy Patriot missiles operated by German troops, so saying that it to Ukraine would mean NATO deployment or German deployment in the country, risking a serious escalation with Russia. Polish defense minister said that sounded reluctant when accepting the offer on Tuesday, expressing disappointment that it would not go to Ukraine. But following conversation with the German Defense Ministry, I disappointingly accepted the decision to reject support for Ukraine, he said. And so, we do have this interesting thing where Poland was basically just trying to get it shipped over to Ukraine, but now they'll take it for themselves. All right, last article here. Finland doesn't have a clear date on when Turkey will approve NATO bid. Finland's foreign minister said Thursday that while there's been some progress in alleviating Turkey's concerns on Finland and Sweden's NATO bid, there is still no date on when Ankara will ratify their membership. And remember, there's 2 countries, Turkey and Hungary, that have not ratified the NATO membership bids for the 2 Nordic states that are tied together. And because it's a joint application bid, if Turkey is disapproving of Sweden joining, then Finland won't be able to join because their bid is tied to Sweden's, at least at this point. Although Hungary, the other country, has signaled that they will go ahead and allow Sweden and Finland to join NATO after the start of the new year. This is from the Finnish foreign minister. What we are still missing is a clear date, a clear plan for the Turkish parliament to deal with this issue. He went on to say that he hopes memberships are approved ahead of Turkey's 2023 election. Western officials told the NY Times on Tuesday that they fear Turkish President Recep Erdogan may be willing to delay Sweden and Finland's NATO bids for several more months, or in the nightmare scenario, he could block them entirely. Blinken was more optimistic and said that Turkey's concerns are being addressed, and he expects the Nordic nations will soon join the alliance. I have every expectation that both will formally become members soon. And there are a lot of concerns, most center around the Kurdish issue and actually what's going on either in eastern Turkey or Syria, where Turkey says that there is terrorist Kurds, and the PKK is a terrorist group, has carried out terrorist attacks. The Turkish Kurds are a repressed minority, and so that's a part of what's going on here. Turkey has invaded various regions of Syria to deal with what they say is the Turkish threat, and it looks like another invasion is coming. And as I said, when Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO, that it would ultimately be the Kurds who pay that price with their blood, and that definitely seems to be the case. It looks like the White House is removing restrictions on Turkey getting new F-16, so that is in the future as well. And with that, I will wrap up the show. Thank you everybody so much for tuning in. As always, the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde, so if you want to get some CBD products, head on over to Paloma Verde and use the promo code PEACE, PEACE. That will save you 20% off and get the show kit back. And you can help out the Libertarian Institute right now by just making a donation and getting yourself some of our great kit bats that we offer. libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Thanks, everyone.